Forget the polished imagery of knights shining under the sun, sword drawn, charging heroically into battle. The reality of a medieval battle was far more terrifying and disorderly. There were no sweeping orchestral themes playing in the background, nor noble duels fought with elegance and chivalry. It was muddy, loud, confusing, and above all, deadly. Most soldiers weren't seasoned warriors. They were peasants with blistered hands, drafted into fighting by lords they barely knew. On the morning of a battle, these men found themselves standing in soggy fields, sweating inside padded garments, while clunky helmets squeezed their foreheads. Orders were unclear, the horns signaling the charge barely audible through the din. Ironically, the hornblowers and drummers, the ones who called others into chaos, were positioned safely at the rear. Chronicles from the time often joked that trumpeters had the best survival rate, second only to the noblemen who orchestrated wars from the comfort of their stone fortresses. As the first line advanced, chaos erupted within seconds. Men tripped over roots, stumbled over one another's boots, or simply slipped in the mud. The battlefield wasn't solid ground, it was a trap. Wet grass and hidden ditches turned strong men into flailing figures, crashing face first into filth, cursing in pain as illusions of glory vanished. The forward motion wasn't a heroic charge, it was a shuffle of dread. Your feet sank into the muck, your knees wobbled from hours of standing still, and your stomach turned from the stench of garlic, sweat, and pure fear radiating from your companions. Communication was impossible. Everyone shouted, but nobody understood each other. Historians studying battlefield acoustics estimate that over 70% of fighters made involuntary sounds, grunts, screams, sobs they'd never recall afterward. If you could translate the noise, it wouldn't sound like commands. It would sound like desperate pleas. "Get me out of here!" Or, "Why did I... come!" And then the chaos escalated. An enemy shield slammed into yours, and the shock rattled through your bones. The clang of metal wasn't theatrical. It was overwhelming. A deafening blend of grunts, yells, and steel clashing against armor or flesh. Your arms trembled trying to block blows. Strategies dissolved instantly. Whatever plan your commander had laid out was forgotten the moment the fighting began. From then on, survival became your sole objective. Falling wasn't an option. You'd be crushed beneath boots, trampled by allies, or impaled by a foe. Blood and vomit turned the ground into a slick death trap. The summer heat inside your armor was unbearable, cooking your body like meat wrapped in cloth and steel. And this was only the beginning. Once you made it through the first clash, another grim truth revealed itself. This wasn't a duel between equals. It was a savage brawl, more akin to a drunken tavern fight than a staged tournament. There were no rules, no code of chivalry. Upheld in the heat of combat, the idea of fighting man to man was a fantasy. If 5 enemies swarmed you, that wasn't cheating, it was survival. The battlefield was so crowded you barely had enough space to raise your arms. Shoulder to shoulder, with only a few inches between bodies, swinging a sword, as they do in films, was impossible. Most of the time, you jabbed awkwardly forward, like trying to poke someone in a market crowd. And despite the romantic image of the sword, it wasn't even the deadliest weapon. Forensic analysis of medieval skeletons shows that fatal injuries more often came from crushing blows to the skull or neck, delivered when someone had fallen and was then finished off. The noble idea of defeating an opponent with honor was replaced by a brutal, efficient philosophy. Knock them down and don't stop hitting until they stopped moving. Just to be sure you'd hit them again. The weapon's hilt, heavy and solid, was often more useful than its blade, wielded like a hammer against helmets and faces. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. Armor saved lives, but it came with its own tortures. Helmets narrowed your vision to a tiny slit, reducing the world to a blurry tunnel. In the heat of battle, that slit became fogged with sweat and breath. Inside, temperatures soared past 40 degrees Celsius in just minutes. Many knights, especially in battles like Hastings, didn't die from wounds, but from heat exhaustion, baked alive in their gear like lobsters in armor pots. Falling in such conditions meant you had 2 seconds, at most, to get back up before being trampled or pierced through any exposed part. Excavations from battles such as Visby revealed dozens of corpses face down in shallow mud, asphyxiated rather than slain by swords. Even if your armor deflected a frontal blow, a strike from behind or the side could finish you off. The typical soldier was attacked from 3 or more directions within seconds. Turning your head constantly in an attempt to spot threats was ironically the best way to lose it. In truth, the main killers weren't expert swordplay or daring maneuvers. They were confusion, blunt force, and the panic of being overwhelmed. Combat was not about finesse. It was about staying upright in a whirlpool of destruction. And if you managed that, you still had to survive what flew toward you next. Since we're diving deep into the raw, unfiltered reality of medieval warfare, let me quickly share a personal goal. This channel is aiming to reach 1,000 subscribers by June 30th. If you appreciate honest, grounded storytelling about history without the usual romantic gloss, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps keep this project alive. The weapons themselves weren't elegant heirlooms. They were crude tools of destruction. Axes, for instance, looked less like artisan-crafted weapons and more like something stolen from a woodcutter's shed. Their design had one goal: obliteration. You didn't need years of training to swing one. Effectively, just aim at something soft, swing hard, and let momentum do the rest. But there was a dangerous flaw. Once embedded in a shield or body, axes often got stuck. Archaeological finds at battle sites like Towton confirm that many axe-wielders died while trying to retrieve their weapons, frozen in a fatal second of vulnerability. Spears were even more common, used by over 70% of some armies. Cheap to produce, easy to train with, and deadly in reach, a well-placed thrust could strike a man 2 meters away before he even got close. But in a densely packed formation, these weapons became more of a hazard than a help. Accounts from battles like Crécy describe soldiers being wounded by their own comrades more often than the enemy. Jabs meant for foes sometimes landed in friendly backs. The confusion and close quarters meant a moment's hesitation or misjudgment could be fatal. In that chaos, loyalty didn't always save you. To deal with advancing armor technology, soldiers turned to even more brutal tools. Maces, metal balls attached to handles, were especially effective. They didn't cut, they crushed. A direct hit didn't need to pierce the armor. It simply caved it inward, smashing bone and organ beneath. Brutally simple and terrifyingly effective. Religious knights favored them too, not out of strategy, but morality. According to the church's peculiar reasoning, since maces didn't shed blood like blades, they were considered more acceptable in holy warfare. A twisted logic: don't slash, just pulverize. Meanwhile, swords remained rare and symbolic. Expensive and often personalized, they were carried mostly by noblemen or elite soldiers. A sword cost the same as a small house, and they weren't invincible. Many were repaired several times, often snapping mid-battle and turning into nothing more than glorified metal sticks. Then there were improvised weapons, farming tools turned deadly. Flails, pitchforks, even sharpened shovels appeared in battles like Bannockburn. Up to 20% of peasant soldiers wielded repurposed tools, surprisingly effective in close combat. Dying by a shovel was no less final than a knight's blade, just more humiliating. On the battlefield, efficiency ruled. Whether your weapon was forged or found, its purpose was the same: break the enemy however possible. Weapon quality varied wildly. Nobles had access to finely forged blades and custom armor crafted by skilled blacksmiths. Common foot soldiers, however, received mass-produced gear that often rusted, snapped, or failed entirely under pressure. It wasn't uncommon for weapons to break mid-swing or shields to split upon impact. Desperation forced many to fight with whatever they could grab, rocks, clubs, or fallen enemies' gear. Medieval battlefields were not showcases of artistry, but marketplaces of improvised survival. Armor, while helpful, was far from a guarantee. Chainmail could deflect a slash once or twice, but a heavy axe or mace would bend it inward, turning it into a jagged weapon against the wearer's flesh. Medical records from battles like Barnet in 1471 revealed that 40% of knights wearing full armor still suffered broken bones. Protection in many cases was just a buffer, one that delayed injury rather than preventing it. Blows didn't slice, they shattered. An overhead strike to the shoulder could crush bone, disabling an arm completely. Medieval weapons weren't precise instruments. They tore, bludgeoned, and maimed. Survivors of these strikes often didn't die immediately. Many bled out or succumbed to infection in the hours or days that followed, victims not just of combat, but of crude battlefield medicine and filthy conditions. Blood loss was one of the most common causes of death. A human body holds around 10 pints of blood, and losing even 2 could lead to dizziness or unconsciousness. Some fighters didn't even realize they'd been mortally wounded until their legs buckled or their vision dimmed. Internal injuries were especially insidious. A single solid blow to the chest or head could rupture organs or cause fatal brain bleeding without any external signs. Medieval surgeons called these hidden evils, wounds that looked minor until the victim suddenly collapsed. Not all injuries were grand or cinematic. Teeth were knocked out by stray blows to the helmet. Eyes were lost to splinters from shattered shields. Small cuts, mere scratches by modern standards, could become death sentences if they became infected. After battles like Tewkesbury in 1471, records from monastery hospitals showed that for every soldier who died on the field, 3 more died in the following days due to infection. There were no clean hospitals, no antibiotics, and no sanitized tools. The closest thing to medical care was a fellow soldier tying a belt around your limb to stop the bleeding or searing your wound shut with a heated dagger. The pain scale of the Middle Ages ranged from "I can still fight" to "please just end it." Field hospitals, if they existed at all, were little more than makeshift tents filled with straw, moans, and the scent of rot. Surgical instruments weren't sterilized, sometimes not even wiped clean. Success rates for operations hovered around 30%, and the most common procedure by far was amputation. Not necessarily because it was the best option, but because it was quick. Infection was such a prevalent killer that removing a limb often seemed safer than trying to treat it. Yet even those who physically survived the battle often bore mental scars just as deep. Accounts from survivors of clashes like Shrewsbury in 1403 describe men waking from nightmares for years after, tormented by visions of friends screaming or enemies crumbling under their own weapons. The psychological toll was overwhelming. After just 10 minutes of intense fighting, many soldiers lost their sense of direction entirely. The spinning movement, the constant turning to face new attackers, and the limited visibility caused by helmets and chaos created disorientation so extreme that some soldiers didn't know where they were or which way was home. With no radios or visual coordination tools, entire units dissolved into confused clusters within minutes. Battle reports from Towton recount that over 60% of fighters couldn't tell which direction they faced after the initial charge. It's no surprise that sometimes both armies fled at the same time, unsure whether they were retreating from or advancing toward their enemies. Friend and foe were hard to distinguish once the mud, blood, and sweat coated everyone's colors and banners. Even identifying symbols became useless, blurred by dirt or ripped away during combat. In the heat of battle, soldiers sometimes turned their weapons on their own comrades. Studies of battlefield remains and records suggest that nearly 10% of casualties were from friendly fire. It wasn't cowardice or treason. It was panic. Split-second decisions made in a whirl of motion, sound, and fear often ended in tragedy. One of the most harrowing realizations a soldier could have was noticing he was drenched in blood, but unsure whether it was his own, a comrade's, or the enemy's. Splashes from a nearby strike could paint you red in seconds, and in that state, pausing to check for wounds was dangerous. You just kept fighting and hoped you were still whole. In that whirlwind of motion and instinct, decision-making ceased to be conscious. You didn't think. Your body simply reacted. Training, if you had any, kicked in automatically, like a rehearsed dance, where the rhythm was survival and every misstep could be fatal. Soldiers later recalled fighting as if they were watching from outside their own bodies. Movements happened without memory. Survivors from battles such as Hastings confessed they couldn't recall specific moments, only fragmented flashes of motion, noise, and pain. It was like driving home and forgetting the last few miles, except instead of missing a turn, you had stabbed a stranger. In such extreme stress, the brain's higher functions often shut down, leaving only basic survival instincts. Modern psychologists studying combat behavior call this a combat mind state, where adrenaline erases logic and fear overrides thought. Tactical orders and formations vanished within minutes, replaced by an almost animalistic frenzy. You weren't targeting soldiers anymore. You were striking at shapes, silhouettes, anything that moved. And when exhaustion crept in, your vision narrowed to a tunnel of flickering motion, steel flashes, blurred limbs, indistinct screams. Humanity faded, and every figure became a potential threat. Veterans of battles like Flodden in 1513 described entering a state where people no longer looked like people. They were just objects of danger. Swing first, question later. Time itself warped. Minutes could stretch into what felt like hours, or entire sections of combat would disappear from memory. Amid this mental fog, your body kept going, automated by instinct, while your consciousness receded into white noise. And then, when it all became too much, when your limbs burned and your lungs begged for air, one thought took over: run. Records show that up to 40% of soldiers fled before battles even reached their climax. For common footmen, this wasn't cowardice, it was self-preservation. Most had families, farms, and no real stake in the ambitions of the nobility. Why die for a cause that wasn't theirs? A popular saying among peasants at the time was, "The grave is full of heroes, the tavern is full of runners." And they weren't wrong. Many battles ended not when one side was defeated in glorious combat, but when fear spread faster than orders. Panic triggered mass retreats. In the infamous Battle of Hastings, Saxon forces withdrew, regrouped, and returned multiple times before finally breaking. If this kind of honest and human-centered approach to history resonates with you, don't forget to like this video and follow the channel. It's a small gesture that really supports content that respects the truth behind the stories we think we know. Not everyone who fled did so in full view. Some feigned death, others dropped their weapons and cried for mercy. There are even documented cases like that of a French soldier at the Battle of Formigny in 1450 who survived by hiding inside the carcass of a dead horse for hours. It's not the kind of tale you pass proudly to your grandchildren, but it kept him alive. Desertion wasn't without consequences. Those who ran risked being labeled cowards by their peers or even executed if caught. And running while wearing armor was its own punishment. Heavy chainmail and plate slowed you down, drained your stamina, and turned every step into a struggle. After just a few hundred meters, even the fittest fighters collapsed from exhaustion. Many knights were captured because they simply couldn't outrun their pursuers. For those who made it far enough, survival brought a strange kind of victory, not the kind with banners and cheering, but one that sounded like labored breath and beating hearts. In reality, victory didn't mean conquest. It meant standing when the dust finally settled. There were no medals, no applause, just the silence of a field strewn with corpses and the slow realization, I'm still alive. What followed wasn't celebration. It was survival. Survivors didn't cheer. They staggered. They looked for clean water, wiped the blood from their faces, sometimes their own, often not, and searched the field for missing friends. The aftermath was grim and practical. If your arms and legs still worked, that was already a blessing. Many roamed the battlefield collecting gear from the dead, stripping armor, boots, and anything valuable regardless of allegiance. The dead didn't need it anymore, and supplies were scarce. This grim scavenging was a form of medieval recycling. Nothing went to waste. Swords, daggers, helmets, if it shone or sliced, it was claimed. Then came the drinking, not in joy but in desperation. Chronicles from Wakefield in 1460 tell of soldiers drinking for 3 days straight, trying to erase the horror with alcohol. The so-called victory feasts weren't about glory, they were about drowning the memories. The wounded flooded whatever makeshift medical stations were available, praying for a miracle or a painless end. Over half wouldn't make it. Surgeons had minutes to decide, save or discard. As for those who walked away, their real battle was just beginning. Even after leaving the battlefield, peace was a distant dream. Many who survived physically carried wounds that would never fully heal, limps, missing fingers, or constant pain from shattered bones. But worse were the mental scars. Nightmares, sudden fits of rage, or blank stares into the void became common among veterans. They relived screams in their sleep, woke up swinging fists at shadows, or wept silently without knowing why. Some developed what today we recognize as PTSD, though back then it had no name, only whispers of madness or melancholy. Entire villages knew which men had seen too much. They moved differently, spoke less, and drank more. Some never returned to their former selves. The trauma wasn't just from what they saw, but from what they did. Killing a man at close range, especially with a crude weapon, left a mark not just on your hands, but deep in your soul. And in many cases there was no priest or healer to offer comfort, only silence and the hope that time would blur the images. For many, war didn't end with the final blow. It lived on inside them, day after day. The land itself bore the memory of conflict. Years after major battles, farmers still found bones or rusted blades buried in the soil. Fields once soaked in blood grew wildflowers, but the earth never forgot. In places like Bosworth, remnants of the dead continued to surface for generations. Helmets, spurs, fragments of chainmail. Children played where men had died in agony. Locals spoke of ghosts and cursed grounds. Some avoided the old fields altogether, convinced they were haunted. These weren't just myths, they were acknowledgments of the horrors that had unfolded there. The echo of battle lingered not just in memory, but in the very ground beneath their feet. And while bards might sing of glory and triumph, those who had been there knew the truth. Glory was for the storytellers, for the men who stood in those mud-choked fields. Combat had been nothing but a test of endurance, a desperate effort to stay alive for just one more second. No one felt noble. No one felt proud. They felt lucky. Lucky to have breath in their lungs and strength in their legs. In medieval war, surviving was the only true form of victory. The glorification of medieval warfare in modern stories often strips away its raw cruelty. Films show crisp banners fluttering, heroes galloping toward danger with noble purpose, and armies moving like choreographed dancers. But the real thing was closer to a nightmare made of noise, sweat, and blind panic. There was no room for beauty in battle, only survival. Heroes weren't born on the battlefield. They were created in hindsight by those who never had to feel the weight of a shattered ribcage or hear a friend gurgle through a throat wound. Most who lived through a clash didn't remember epic speeches or inspirational moments. They remembered crawling through mud, choking on the smell of blood, and praying they wouldn't be the next to fall. And yet, despite this grim reality, they went back. Time and again, men returned to war, whether by duty, poverty, or coercion. Some believed they were fighting for a just cause, but most had no illusions. They fought because they had to, because turning back meant punishment, or worse, shame. Medieval battle wasn't a quest for honor, it was a crucible of suffering, and surviving it made you something different. Not a hero, perhaps, but something stronger. In the end, what remained after the clamor of steel and screams had faded was silence and questions. Questions that haunted the survivors far more than the battle ever did. Why did I live? Why didn't he? What am I now? These weren't easy to answer. The battlefield left no one untouched. Even victors sat quietly amid the wreckage, staring at the sky with vacant eyes. They weren't basking in glory. They were trying to remember who they were before the fight began. In medieval warfare, triumph wasn't measured by land conquered or enemies slain. It was measured by those who could walk away even limping, even broken. For some, the final challenge wasn't the sword or the mace, but what came after. The return to normal life, the attempt to sleep without hearing phantom cries. The war never truly ended. It followed them home, in bruises, in empty beds, in haunted dreams. And yet, some found a way to move forward, to rebuild, to protect instead of destroy. They became farmers again, fathers, brothers. Not because they forgot, but because they endured. That was their quiet, undeniable victory. And that endurance, silent and uncelebrated, is what defined those who truly survived medieval warfare. Not just the men who left the battlefield breathing, but those who refused to let the blood and screams define the rest of their lives. They had no counselors, no therapy, no recognition for what they endured. Only the choice to carry on. Many did so not for themselves, but for their families, their communities, for the chance to grow old in peace. In a world where war was common and life fragile, choosing to live quietly, to heal, to find purpose beyond violence was an act of courage, as great as any charge across a field. The strongest didn't swing the sharpest swords. They held their families through fear, rebuilt homes with scarred hands, and gave their children a life free from what they had witnessed. These were the true warriors of the Middle Ages, not the ones remembered in songs or etched in stone, but the ones who, after facing death, chose life over and over again, even without applause, even without glory. So when you imagine a medieval battle, don't think of gallant knights riding into the sunset with honor gleaming on their armor. Think of a man standing knee-deep in mud, his ears ringing, hands trembling, heart pounding, not with pride, but with the desperate will to survive. Think of someone who fought not because he loved war, but because he had no choice. And when it was over, he didn't claim a crown, he claimed another day to breathe. That is the untold story of medieval combat. Not the triumph of kingdoms, but the quiet victories of individuals. Those who stood back up, who helped the wounded, who walked away and chose not to return to hatred. In their silence, in their pain, and in their resilience lies a message far greater than banners or ballads could carry. A reminder that real strength is measured not by how many you can defeat, but by how deeply you can endure and still choose kindness. And that, even in the blood-soaked chaos of the past, is something worth remembering. And now, I'd love to hear from you. After everything you've just seen, how do you think you would react in a medieval battle? Would you fight, flee, or try to disappear among the fallen? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your feedback means a lot and helps shape the future of this channel.